So you have finally come to me in your time of need. A time to review The Godfather. Well, you have come to the right place. But having said that, I do have a very long memory. You see, you call it upon me to review your favorite books, your favorite movies, your favorite video games, anime, and manga. You ask me to give you writing advice as an amateur to another amateur. And yet, I ask for so little in return. I ask for a subscription. I ask for your viewership, a like, a comment, for you to share the video with your friends and family. And yet you cannot even give me that. You seek justice, but you will not give me justice. I do so much for you, and in return you give me nothing. I ask it upon you. Reach into your heart and find the generosity. Call me Godfather, and put me in your subscriptions. Ring the notification bell, and turn on all notifications, so you know when your Godfather makes a new video, so you may pay your debts.
Hey everybody, Josh again. I know some of you might be disappointed I didn't keep the mustache on after the introduction, but that thing is way too tough to talk with. When I'm wearing it, kind of compresses the top of my mouth. So, anyway, today we're going to be talking about a personal favorite of mine, The Godfather by Mario Puzo. I typically like to save my final grades for these books toward the end of the video, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. As of right now, this is my favorite book of all time. That might change in the future, but at the time of this recording, The Godfather is my favorite book ever. So you already know that's going to get an A+ for me from that alone. I don't know how many of you notice how many cliches there are in Mafia stories, because I don't really see a lot of people talking about them. But, for example, things like guys named Paulie or Vito. Pretty much every mob story has a guy named Paulie or Vito in it. A lot of times there's a giant fat dude that loves to cook, loves even more to eat, and that always talks about his mama's cooking and how great it was, how there's never been a better cook than his mama. Seemingly at the beginning of every Mafia story, they're flaunting the many perks of the Mafia lifestyle. For example, the women, the booze, the money, the ability to basically do whatever you want and not have to worry about getting arrested because they have the cops on their side. And oftentimes there's a lot of Mafia warfare between rivaling families, and even inside the same families, there's a lot of feud, a lot of strife, and a lot of betrayal, usually from a mole that is promised a lot of money or a promotion in another family to sell out their own family. Again, those are just my observations from having read and watched and played a lot of Mafia stories, especially involving the Italian and the Sicilian mobs. I just don't see those discussed a whole lot. But having made that a point of emphasis to show you the cliches and tropes that are prevalent in a lot of mob stories, I can start by saying that all of those got their start in The Godfather. A lot of you watching this have, I assume, watched at least one of the Godfather movies, and maybe have not read the book. Some of you might not even know that the book exists, that the film trilogy was just created by some Hollywood writer. I can guarantee you that's not the case. Hollywood is definitely not that creative to come up with something like that. The book was published in 1969, and within 2 years of its publication, it had already sold 9 million copies. The book was also on the New York Times bestseller list for 67 consecutive weeks, which is approximately a year and 3 months. So, the movie came out in 1972, the first one, and by that time, the Godfather book had already sold at least 9 million copies before the movie ever hit theaters. So yeah, the book was kind of popular by the time the movie had come out. Now, if you have watched the first movie but haven't read the book, I will say that what they did adapt into the movie from the book is very faithful to its source material. In fact, I'm even willing to say that from a movie that's based on a book, The Godfather has the most faithful adaptation from book to film I've ever seen from anything. The reason why the first movie is so faithful to the book is because it was written by two guys, Francis Ford Coppola, who was the director, and Mario Puzo, who was the author. I know it sounds weird to hear that the author had a big hand in writing a screenplay for the adaptation of his book, but it's not like Puzo was there just because he was the author or because he had a connection to a big-time Hollywood producer. Puzo had written screenplays before, so it wasn't like this was just his first time writing a film. So because of Puzo's background as a screenwriter, he was able to collaborate with Francis Ford Coppola on writing the scripts for the first movie, hence why it's such a faithful adaptation. But enough talk about the movie, now let's move on to the book. The first time I read The Godfather, I could tell from the very first page that it was going to be good. And I'm not talking about the first page of the actual story. I'm talking about this note from Anthony Puzo, Mario Puzo's son. I don't know if you can read the red underlined quote here very well, but it reads, "He often yelled at his children to be quiet. He was writing a bestseller." As an amateur writer, I gotta love that mindset. As for the opening for the first chapter, it provides you with an immediate impression of the range of influence that Don Vito Corleone. Puzo writes 3 different scenarios where the character's solution to fix their own individual problems that are completely separate from one another is to go and meet with Don Corleone. The movie opens with Amigo Bonacera meeting with Don Corleone on his daughter's wedding day in his office, but in the book, it shows Bonacera sitting in the courtroom listening to the judge give out the sentence to the 2 boys that beat the crap out of his daughter. Once the judge gives his verdict that the boys' sentence is to be suspended, Bonacera looks at his wife sitting next to him and say they must go to Don Corleone for justice. The second situation Puzo writes is about Johnny Fontaine and, to put it politely, his marital troubles. And after he and his wife have a little argument, to say the least, he thinks he has to go and meet with his godfather, Don Corleone, for advice. The third and final situation that Puzo writes is about a baker named Nazarene, who is a longtime friend of the Don. His daughter becomes pregnant with the baby of an Italian immigrant who is about to be deported back to Italy. So to prevent his daughter from having to raise a child on their own and to prevent his grandchild from being raised fatherless, he has to go to Don Corleone for his last ray of hope. The reason I like this opening for the first chapter so much is because you get a clear understanding of how powerful and influential Don Corleone is without him even being introduced to you at this point in the book. Now, I think now's a good time to mention that even though this book is about mafia and violence and justice and everything like that, there is a lot of sex in this book. I swear, there is so much sex in this book that, especially involving the parts with Johnny Fontaine, who is a much more prominent character in this book than he is in the movie. I swear, some of the scenes in here make 50 Shades of Grey look like a Dr. Seuss book. But it isn't just the naughty scenes that provide a tremendous amount of detail. Puzo's impeccable attention to detail is really what makes The Godfather such a timeless classic. From describing people's appearances, to describing how someone gets the crap beaten out of them or murdered, to going back to describing sex scenes. I mean, everything in this book is so fascinating and so incredibly detailed that it really gives you a sense of imagery in your head, even if you haven't watched the film yet. Another thing that makes the Godfather book stand out is the fact that it doesn't feel like someone telling a fictional story. It reads like a historian talking about an actual, real-life mafia family. I've read my own fair share of non-fiction mafia books. I've read Wise Guy. I've read biographies about Al Capone. I've read about the 5 families of New York. And having read all these, I can definitely tell that Puzo was inspired by real-life mobsters, and they're depicted with his characters. Real-life mafia events are depicted in The Godfather, and the hierarchy of mafia families. It all reads like a non-fiction book. Despite the fact that he was never associated with the real-life mob, you can definitely tell Puzo included his own personal experiences in The Godfather as well. Puzo was raised in New York City during the Roaring 20s and early 1930s amid Prohibition, and with the banning of alcohol came the peak of organized crime syndication in the United States. Puzo definitely wrote a part of his own self into the character of Michael Corleone. For example, Michael was born in 1920 in New York City, as was Puzo. Michael went on to fight in the United States Marine Corps overseas during World War II. In reality, Puzo served in the Army Air Forces in World War II in Germany. I think this is why Puzo made Michael the focal point of the book, was because he wanted to inject a part of himself into the main character, and Michael was really the only logical choice between him, Sonny, and Fredo. Now, Puzo did write 3 more sequels to The Godfather, but they weren't nearly as commercially successful as The Godfather. The first book is The Sicilian, which follows Michael's journey in Sicily with more detail. The second is The Last Don, and the third is Omerta. And no, if you're thinking that the 2 other movies in the film trilogy were based on those 3 books, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, but they weren't. The part where it shows a young Vito Corleone immigrating to America and showing him landing at Ellis Island and everything subsequent to that, that is the only part that I found in either of the other 2 films that was in The Godfather that they just didn't put in the first film because they really didn't have enough time or a good place to put it. But everything else in the latter 2 films was made completely from scratch by both Puzo and Ford Capella. They were not in the books. So even though I've showered endless praise on this book, and in my opinion rightfully so, there's still one polarizing part I need to talk about, and that involves the sections with Johnny Fontaine. As I mentioned earlier, Fontaine is a far more prominent character in the books than he is in the films. When you read about him in The Godfather, it's pretty obvious he's based off Frank Sinatra. In terms of what we read about when we follow Fontaine in the book, we read about his family struggles, his diminishing ability to sing, him trying to resurrect his career as a musician and an actor, and that's just to name a few. There's a lot more involving friends, family. The reason this is so polarizing is because Puzo spends a lot of time talking about Fontaine and other people that are connected to Fontaine but really don't contribute anything to the main plot involving Michael, the Don, and the entire Corleone family regime. And I totally understand why people don't really like the Fontaine parts. I personally love them, but that's just me. So yeah, if you start to read a chapter and it's all about Fontaine, or it's all about Jules Segal or Lucy Mancini or anyone else connected with Fontaine loosely, you could honestly probably skip those chapters and not miss anything in terms of the plot involving Michael and the Corleone family regime. But having said that, I would still recommend that you read them just because of Puzo's writing prowess and the fact that even though they're not connected to the main plot, they're still very fascinating to read. And alas, we've now come toward the end. I've said everything I've wanted to say about The Godfather. As I mentioned earlier, at the time of this recording on September 13th, 2020, this is my favorite book of all time. Of course, that could change in the future, but The Godfather and Mario Puzo have inspired me to try and write my own Mafia story, and if you're watching this video, maybe you'll read that book sometime in the future. But until then, I'll keep making these reviews, and the next review I do is not going to be about a book. I won't tell you what it is outside of that, but I think you'll like it. And until then, everyone, thank you for watching.